Great. So here we are today. Today is the 12th of June, 2023. And this is the day the sun transitions from the days of hazel into the days of apple. So it's the transition day, and tomorrow's the first full day of apple. And apple is the next 18 days or so. Each tree has 18 degrees of the sun's ecliptic. So it roughly translates as just over 18 days. It's like 18 and a quarter days or something like that. So today, sticking with the theme of the year, we're looking at medicine and herbalism, and the apple tree has tons, of course, but I am going to talk about a little bit of apple lore as well, because the lore of the apple tree is very, very profound and potent to Celtic mythology. I'm only going to be able to skim over little aspects of it, and what I'll promise to do is in the months to come I'll make more YouTube videos going into specific details. For instance, today we're going to touch on Avalon and the Arthurian mysteries of Avalon, but that's a huge topic. So skimming over apple and looking at its lore, I can't go deeply into Avalon. I'll just give some glimpses into it. And to do that, I'll bring up my PowerPoint presentation. That was quicker than normal. So anyway, then, so today, apple, that takes us from the 21st degree of Gemini to the 9th degree of Cancer, the crab. It's the last 9 degrees of Gemini and the first 9 degrees of apple. So it's right in the middle, making its 18 degrees, 9 and 9, and so on. And the star law, if you like, of the days of apple is the summer solstice. And of course, that's a huge topic, just like the winter solstice is. So there's a load of mythological lore corresponding to the summer solstice, which the apple tree holds. But what I'm going to do is try and anchor it as much as I can to the Irish Celtic mythologies. However, there's so many centuries of Celtic mythology, if you like, or Celtic culture, right up to the modern day, even, like the river dance in the Eurovision Song Contest, with the Irish dancing and Celtic music, it's still a living, vibrant thing, Celtic culture. So when you say Celtic, it means so many things to so many people on different levels, but myself being a little bit of a mythological nerd and a history nerd, I have to categorize it chronologically in my brain, and my brain's not great with modern fictions, because I don't read modern fictions because it interrupts my brain when I'm trying to remember what was written in the 12th century, what was written in the 14th century, and so on. So that's my own blinkered way of looking at things. I just try and be a custodian of where things belong chronologically as far as evidence goes, and I realize that makes me a bit stiff and awkward, maybe, but equally it gives me clarity. Having said that, with visionary work, any vision is valid, even if it contradicts the early sources. Now I'm just going to go off on a tangent as a brief example. The most famous story with King Arthur and Guinevere is Guinevere's love affair with Lancelot. That's such a big thing in most people's minds in regards to the stories of King Arthur. But in the original stories of King Arthur, there was no Sir Lancelot. there was no adulterous affair. You know, that so that it's amazing how really big story plots appear much later than the original stories. Originally, Guinevere is a Venus goddess. You know, she's a triple goddess of the Welsh people. And in the old Welsh archives, King Arthur had 3 queens, it's a triple goddess, and each of the 3 queens was called Guinevere. It was very different to the later French romances of Guinevere having an affair with Lancelot. Anyway, by the by, it's just an example of how my brain is kind of compartmentalized into different periods of history. So some Celtic stories are theoretically very, very old, coming from the end of the Iron Age, but they weren't written down until the early medieval times. So some old stories are Irish in origin, some old Celtic stories are Welsh in origin, or Brittany in France in origin. And then those older stories become the inspiration for medieval romances. Now, a lot of the King Arthur stories that we're familiar with are from French and German medieval romances. So that's over 1,000 years from the Iron Age, you know, from King Arthur's real time. If King Arthur really existed, it's around about the 5th century, 6th century. You know, and it's another 800 years before the love stories are told and the magical stories are told about the sword and the stone and so on. But there's roots to all of those stories. So then, the Apple law predominantly corresponds with the law of what you could just call the summer queen, or the fairy queen, or Dame Venus, or Lady Venus, or Guinevere. You know, she's got many different names because she appears in many different stories, but she's the sovereignty goddess of the land, really, in her royal prime as the Queen of Summer. No, now she does have examples in ancient Ireland. There is in South Munster, South Ireland, a goddess of the summer solstice, and her name is Anya. Now, Anya is the summer solstice goddess queen. She's a sovereignty queen. Her stories are very sparse. There's not a lot written about her, but just enough to give us those details. And what stories there are quite unpleasant. She's raped and abused. You know, it's kind of patriarchy abusing the old matriarchal belief system of the Celts, maybe, or it's Christianity over paganism, whatever, you know. But a common theme throughout Ireland and Wales and Brittany is that the king, the would-be king of any kingdom, has to marry the goddess of the land. Can't be king of the land without marrying the goddess of the land. So that story's told in 100 different ways, and the queen has many different names, you know. So Anya is her name in South Ireland, and in Tara, her name was Maeve, becomes Queen Mab in Elizabethan times. Even Morrigan is the same thing, because Morrigan can mean the great queen, you know, so it's a recurring thing. So in South Wales, she's Rhiannon, and in North Wales, she's Ellen, you know. But it's always this solar, golden, shining, radiant, summertime queen, you know. And I would speculate that the story of the second Acma, from the Hawthorne onwards, is all about the young would-be king trying to win the right to marry the goddess of the land. So it's almost like Hawthorne throws the test, and then there's the archetypal theatre of the oak and the holly battling at Beltane. And then there's the wisdom of the hazel tree wizard, like the Celtic Mercury of Tara, what's his name? Three Keys, the triple bearer of the three keys. Don't know how to pronounce his Irish name, but he's almost like the wizard or the Gandalf or the wise mage, mercurial figure that explains to the people how to marry the goddess of the land and be at one and in harmony with the land. You know, old saying with King Arthur is the king and the land are one, you know. And so it's this honoring of the divine feminine. And she holds that position of the summer solstice. She is the apple queen, the fairy queen, Venus, and so on. And then I would suggest, and we'll get to it, is that the third ACMA is about the marriage ceremony between the king and the goddess, you know, and that's played out with all the wine mysteries and stuff. But anyway, so looking at Apple holds the summer solstice, and here on this diagram, this is the pentagram in the Ogham Grove that's called the Rose family pentagram. All of them, apart from Heather, are members of the Rose family. Just like you have the evergreen pentagram, which has 4 evergreens plus willow. Now here you've got 4 Rose family members plus Heather. I don't know why that is. It just is what it is. But you have this Apple, Blackthorn, Hawthorn, Rowan are all part of the Rose family, which is Dame Venus. But Apple is the anchoring point, the summer solstice point. And it interlaces with the evergreen pentagram shown here in this diagram. So the evergreen pentagram is the dark green pentagram, and the Rose family is the golden pentagram here. And they're interlaced perfectly. And we've looked at this before. There's an old bardic story from Ireland that, you know, the story dates back to like the 2nd century or something. It's a long time ago. And it tells of an Irish Romeo and Juliet, and they both die, and from their graves comes a yew tree and an apple tree, and they interlock forever, this kind of perpetual love story. So again, the royal female, the noble princess of the south, was the apple tree. It's the same as Anya being the summer solstice goddess in the south of Ireland. So Apple holds this feminine summertime energy as a polar opposite to a more winter solstice, winter king polarity thing. It's like a yin and yang, if you like, you know. So they're the interplay that's played out with this. And of course, everyone knows you cut an apple in half and you get a 5-pointed star. So that apple is anchoring on that Rose family pentagram is really interesting. It seems deliberate more than just coincidental. And if it is deliberate, that means that the late medieval bardic people of Ireland they had a scheme, they had a system that they were working with. So coming back to home a little bit, this photograph, we mentioned it before I started the presentation. This is Avalon Orchard. It's on the east side of Glastonbury Tor. You can just see the tower of Glastonbury Tor in the top kind of left-hand corner there. And in the foreground is my apple stake with a white hind on it, a white deer, female deer. So, of course, Glastonbury has a whole load of cultural lore as being a contender for being Avalon. And that goes back to 1191, when the monks of the abbey claimed to find King Arthur's grave. And in King Arthur's grave, there was a lead cross. And on the lead cross in broken Latin, it said, "Here lies King Arthur in the Isle of Avalon." So from 1191 onwards, Glastonbury was acknowledged as being Avalon because of King Arthur's grave. And it is to many people, and I'm not going to, I've got no interest in undermining that, you know, but there is older stuff behind it, and there's a lot of political intrigue behind the monks claiming to find King Arthur's grave in the first place. Maybe touch on that in the future. I don't want to tarnish this presentation so much, but Avalon itself literally means place of apples. So we can literally look at the 18 degrees of apple, the days of apple is Avalon. You know, days of apple, and Avalon means place of apples. So, you know, these 18 degrees, these next 18 days are the place of apples, Avalon. But what a lot of people imagine Avalon to be, which is the esoteric, mystical realm beyond this physical realm, there already was a Celtic Brythonic word for that. You know, that the native British word for that magical other world is Annwn, Annwn, Annwn. It wasn't until the medieval times with the Arthurian romances that a guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth gave it the name Avalon. You know, he actually called it in Latin Apollonis. It was spelled AFF and finished with NIS, Apollonis. So that the modern spelling that everyone's familiar with is just a modern spelling. It was spelled differently in the medieval Latin. Not that that matters, but the thing is, even for Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, Avalon was meant to be otherworldly. It was like the Garden of Hesperides. It was a magical paradise place that King Arthur was taken to at the end of his life, somewhere beyond the mortal mountains. You know, it wasn't meant to be a town in Somerset. It's a contentious thing, you know. And in the 12th century, if you weren't a strict Catholic, you could be burnt to death, like the Cathars in the south of France, you know. And so the Welsh people, they had this tradition of King Arthur, that he was somewhere in another paradise, and that one day he would return. The once and future king, he will return when the land needs him. Now, this is actually quite heretical to 12th century Christianity, because in 12th century Christianity, there was only one person that had survived death and would return as a second coming, and that was Jesus, you know. So to have some Dark Age Celtic king living in a paradise that will return one day was not good. Catholics didn't like it, you know. So there's part of the motivation for Glastonbury Abbey to say, no, he's not returning. He's not in a otherworldly paradise. He's here, buried under the earth at Glastonbury, you know. So it made Arthur mortal, flesh and blood. Here's his skeleton. He's not coming back. And it also shut the door on any metaphysical, esoteric, Celtic fairy world, you know. So it's in that kind of context that you have to understand what was going on in Glastonbury. However, Glastonbury was, and still is, an entrance to Annwn. You know, its ancient name is Unis Witrin, which means the glass isle or the Isle of Glass. And it is Avalon in that way, you know, that it is an entry point to the Celtic otherworld. So it's kind of what people think Avalon is, but there were political machinations behind King Arthur's grave. Enough of all of that. So coming back to our patterns of the Owen Grove, apple concludes the second ACMA. So shown here on the left, it goes from Aries with hawthorn, oak, holly, hazel, and apple at the 12 o'clock position is the summer solstice, and it's the conclusion of the second ACMA. And it will lead us into the third ACMA, which I will argue is the divine marriage or sacred marriage or alchemical marriage of the mystery traditions. We have touched on it last year. So one of the things that Geoffrey of Monmouth said about Avalon in his story is he said that King Arthur's sword, Excalibur, was forged in Avalon, you know, forged in the place of apples, forged in the Garden of Hesperides or the other world and stuff. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Arthurian romances are built upon older traditions, and older traditions in Britain before King Arthur was the Roman stuff. And on Hadrian's Wall, there is a depiction of Mithras from Hadrian's Wall, gives us this planetary chakra system. But this is also the culture that gave birth to King Arthur, Merlin, and Taliesin. They were, their ancestors were the Roman Britons, you know, and all of the Arthurian stuff to do with the knights of the Round Table and King Arthur having knights and King Arthur being the Pendragon comes directly from the Roman cavalry. The battle standard of every single Roman cavalry unit was a dragon, and the battle standard bearer was called the Draconarius. It just means holding the dragon's head. So Arthur going to battle under the Pendragon symbol is the same thing, you know, and it's actually old star lore from the Bronze Age when Draco the dragon was the pole, corresponded with the pole star. So Rome had inherited this dragon symbolism from the Bronze Age, which then Merlin and King Arthur in the Dark Ages had inherited from the Roman occupation of Britain. But anyway, here's a really intriguing thing then. When you think that King Arthur's sword was forged in Avalon, the realm of apples, on Hadrian's Wall, on this Mithraic rock birth, Mithras is holding his sword between Gemini and Cancer the crab. That is, he's pointing his sword at summer solstice, the time of apples. That's a very intriguing thing, you know, that the sword here relates to the time of apples, relates to the summer solstice. Just a glimpse into, or what do you call it, mystery tradition motifs inserted into the medieval stories of King Arthur. So where did Geoffrey of Monmouth get Avalon from? Why did he rename Annwn as Avalon? Well, you know, there is in Burgundy in France on the west side of the Alps a town called Avalon, you know, and it's been called Avalon a very long time. And between Avalon and the neighboring town of Vézelay, Vézelay is a really important place in medieval times. It's a cult center for Mary Magdalene and John the Baptist. John the Baptist is the summer solstice figurehead in Christianity. Offerings to the Irish summer solstice goddess of South Island, Anya. Offerings were made to her on St. John's Eve, which is a summer solstice thing. And Sir Gawain, as much as Sir Percival has to find the cup, the grail of the Last Supper, So Gawain has to find the sword that decapitated John the Baptist. So with John the Baptist at Midsummer, there's also this sword emphasis. So whether it's Mithras on Hadrian's wall pointing at summer solstice with his sword, or it's the John the Baptist mystery traditions and the decapitation with the sword, or it's Arthur's sword coming from Avalon. It's all swords and summer solstice, which would go back to the Irish treasures and the sword of Nuada. Anyway, between Avalon and Vézelay in France is a forested area, and the forested area is known as the Avalone. And it's this part of France where the troubadours came from that wrote about Sir Percival and the Holy Grail. Doesn't sit comfortably with the Welsh, you know, but the matter of Britain is vast. It was all one land under the Romans, and it was all one land under the Angevin Empire of the Plantagenet kings, you know, which is the Arthurian romances promoted by Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard the Lionheart, King John, and so on. You know, you can't avoid France. It's where the Grail romances come from. But here's an amazing thing, and this has only been known since the 1970s. You know, so below Vézelay, there were some mounds in the ground, and people thought, oh, it's just ruins of an old castle. That's what they thought until the 1970s. And then in the 1970s, they did archaeology and dug up these mounds, and it revealed a Roman sanctuary of sacred springs and holy wells, a healing sanctuary that was reused by the Romans. However, the Iron Age Celts had used it before the Romans, but more mind-blowing than that, these hot water salty springs that bubble up in the center of France, they're lined by burnt oak lining. They actually burnt the oak to make it kind of waterproof. And they did dendrochronology on the oak lining of these sacred springs and wells, and they're Bronze Age. So this is a Bronze Age healing sanctuary in the Avalone, which is where Arthur went to be healed of his mortal wounds, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth. Not only is it a Bronze Age healing sanctuary, but the river that flows beside it is called the Cure, C-U-R-E, and it means what you think it means. It's the healing rivers, the river of healing. So that's amazing. You know, Geoffrey of Monmouth's writing his fiction about King Arthur, and rather than use the Welsh name for the other world, Annwn, he takes the phrase Avalonis. You know, he actually spells it A-double-F, Avalonis, N-I-S at the end. The modern spelling of Avalon is a modern spelling. That's not the medieval spelling. So he was clearly inspired by this tradition of a healing sanctuary. You know, make of it what you will. I'm going there next summer. I went there in 2013, and I'm going back because it's got really important sacred landscape stuff going on. If you're interested, I touch on all of this in this book. Glastonbury and the Myths of Avalon explains a lot of the political intrigues behind it. Now, I know, you know, in Glastonbury today, there's an Avalon school, there's Avalon coaches, there's Avalon cane furniture, and you can train to be a priestess of Avalon. I'm not undermining any of that. It's all inspired by the culture and the mythology of it all, you know. I would just kind of tinker it a little bit and say that's all medieval, and that the older Brythonic Celtic stuff is Annwn, you know, and the old name of Glastonbury is Unis Witrin, the Isle of Glass, the Glass Isle, you know, and it was an entry point to Annwn. Not the only entry point, just a very important one, but there were many others, you know. So it was a a place for accessing the other world, if you like. So enough of all of that. It was just a kind of opening the can of worms of Avalon during this time of the days of apple. So the medicine of the apple tree then is massive, too much to go into, of course, you know. But I took these photographs today. I took them. I'm here in Guernsey on this little farm, and we've got a small apple orchard. When my friends took over this farm, these apple trees were already here, so we don't know what species they are, what varieties they are. Some of them have already blossomed and are giving fruit now. And the one in the middle is a bit later. It's still blossoming. It's in blossoming time, not fruiting time. But the other, there's the blossom on the middle one. But the others have already blossomed and their fruit are there. So that's quite nice. I was quite pleased with that on the, you know, the transition day of hazel to apple, and the apples are there. They're actually coinciding, if you like. Although there are many different varieties of apple, I understand that the native British apple is what we actually call the crab apple. It's not what they call a cultivated apple. You know, what you get in the supermarket is a cultivated apple. So the indigenous Celtic apple is the small crab apple, which are always a little bit small and hard and sour. They're not lovely for eating fresh, but you would cook them and use them that way, you know. Unless you really like sour, sharp things, you know, but they never really go sweet. So the apples themselves, there's that famous saying, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. So this is just about the fruit, the apple. Highly nutritious, supports weight loss. It's good for the heart. It lowers sugar levels. So eating apples, even though there's fructose, eating apples is good for type 2 diabetes. The apples promote gut health, so they help you have a strong gut flora. They have been shown to prevent cancer. It's a bit contentious. There's an old film that you can see on the internet called Life Without Cancer, and it's this theory that vitamin B17, which is found in apricot kernels, has been shown to be effective against cancer, but big pharmaceuticals disagree. So you have to do your research on it. But as well as apricot kernels, apple pips contain vitamin B17. So, I mean, I'm happy to take the risk, and I always eat all of my apple. I eat the core, I eat the pips, and I believe in the B17 as a preventative medicine. That's my educated choice sort of thing. And it's also just meant to protect the brain. So, but then from the apple, there's other things that can be done. So there is, you can send off, you can buy it online. There's apple blossom tea or apple flower tea. So people drink it as a tea in the mornings predominantly because it improves digestion and eases constipation. So people that have problems like that, it's often a morning drink to try and lighten the day. Apple blossom tea also helps to remove fat, so it helps with weight loss again. It's meant to be really good for the skin, and some people drink it to clear acne away. And it also is a nervine, so it eases the nerves. So if you've got a neurological disorder, it will help heal broken nerves, if you like. And of course, most famously from the apple is the apple cider vinegar. You know, should be in everybody's first aid kit, apple cider vinegar. Well attested to have lots of benefits, including weight loss, lowering sugar levels, balancing cholesterol, helps to reduce varicose veins, and it can whiten teeth, you know, and it just improves the body. It's a good tonic and cleans the skin. So there's a lot of benefits for drinking some apple cider vinegar as well daily. And then following on from the apple cider vinegar, there's the alcoholic drink cider itself, you know, which Somerset is famous for. Glastonbury's in Somerset. The alcoholic drink cider is high in vitamin C, and it's been shown to help fight cancer and help with heart disease and just generally boost the immune system. Obviously, drinking responsibly, not saying have 10 pints and get drunk off your head, but, you know, a pint once in a while is good medicine. Always respect your medicines. So that's kind of it for the apple tree. So it's the apples, apple flower tea, apple cider vinegar, and the alcoholic drink cider. So the mushroom that I chose, it's not unique to the apple tree, but it favors the apple tree. It actually favors the ash tree and the apple tree. And I thought it was quite interesting because the second ACMA is born from the ash at spring equinox and concludes with the apple. So you kind of got ash is the spring equinox and apple is the summer solstice. And this mushroom likes both those trees. It's quite intriguing. So its name, don't know how to pronounce it, Inonotus hispidus, but its nickname is Shaggy Bracket. So the Shaggy Bracket mushroom is not a mushroom that's great for food. Apparently it's quite woody. It's not, you don't want to eat it like a mushroom, but dried, it's a medicine, and it's been used in China for thousands of years. Part of traditional Chinese medicine. So as a dried powdered mushroom, where is it? Again, it's anti-tumor, so it helps fight against cancer. A lot of these bracket mushrooms are anti-cancer. It's a recurring theme. Again, lowers blood sugar levels, so great for diabetes. And it just general all-round tonic for stomach ailments. So again, not as Shaggy Bracket, I think that's a British nickname, but in Chinese traditional herbalism, this bracket mushroom has been used for thousands of years. So that was the only mushroom corresponding with the apple that I could find. And I say it's not unique to the apple, but it favors the apple. And then, having lived in Somerset for the best part of 20 years, one of the most obvious things, Somerset does have lots of apple orchards, and dripping, literally dripping off those apple trees is mistletoe. In Druidic tradition, because of the account written by Pliny the Elder, which is about the white-robed druids harvesting mistletoe from the oak tree and making a bull sacrifice underneath the oak tree, people tend to think of mistletoe with the oak. And that can happen, but it's quite rare. Looking at Wildlife UK for Britain, Woodland Trust thing, mistletoe doesn't really favour the oak tree at all. It favours the apple tree. And that's quite interesting. I'm certainly witness to that in Somerset. Here's a photo of an apple tree in Somerset. You know, the mistletoe is all over it, you know. So, you know, I don't know what to make of the Roman account of the Druids gathering with a golden sickle. Seems odd as well, because gold wouldn't be great as a cutting metal. But that's the story anyway. That Druids gathered mistletoe with a golden sickle from oak trees and sacrificed bulls. But mistletoe itself then loves the apple tree. All of the apple orchards in Somerset are covered in mistletoe. Mistletoe will also grow on hawthorn trees and lime trees, and apparently oak, but rarely on the oak tree. And there are many different varieties of mistletoe, but the mistletoe we've got here is Viscum album, also known as European mistletoe. So some of the other mistletoes are in Asia and America. you know. So for Somerset and Britain and the British Isles, it is just the European mistletoe, really, Viscum album. So the berries are toxic, of course. I'm not talking about the berries, but the leaf. The leaf is a medicine, and the mistletoe leaf is acknowledged as safe even by the FDA in America, and health stores sell mistletoe leaf as a tea. So you can buy mistletoe tea, which is just the dried leaves and the leaf stems. So it's used for many things. It helps, again, lower sugar levels. So the apple medicine and its varieties, and the Shaggy Bracket mushroom and the mistletoe, everything related to the apple tree, is helping the body balance itself out, balances out cholesterol, balances out sugar levels, fights cancer. And it's just fascinating that apple a day keeps the doctor away, that old wife's tale thing, you know. It's there in the cultural grapevine, if you like, you know. So mistletoe tea helps with seizures, helps with headaches, can help with menopause symptoms, helps with cancer, helps with type 2 diabetes and neurological orders in general, stimulates the immune system. You know, for some people, there can be mild side effects, a feeling of an upset stomach or feeling nauseous. The thing to do with that is just to do it, what we would say, microdose, just a little bit, and see if there's a negative side effect. But having said that, there is no evidence of there being any severe side effects, you know. So it's just that with some people, they feel nauseous with it, you know. So it's a bit, if you've never done it before and you want to try, just try a little bit and see how it goes. But it's, you know, the other name for it was all heal, you know, not the berries, but the leaf was all heal. So it was an ancient medicine, you know, and it's used, like I say, it's a safe tea you can buy from most whole food shops. Yeah. Lowers blood sugar levels and boosts the insulin production in the body. So there you go. So that's the medicine to do with the apple tree and some of the apple lore. And we can talk about some of those ideas for a while. I'll leave it recording until we do the meditation, and I'll turn it off. But you can put your microphones back on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks for that. That was wonderful, Yuri. How does one drink, excuse me, apple cider vinegar? I mean, how do you dilute it? Do you put it in tea?
Yeah.
I mean, I would think that would just tear my stomach apart.
What I do, because some years ago I found out I had type 2 diabetes, and so I'm doing my best to reverse it by losing weight and not having too much sugary food, and I'm not using medication. I'm just using diet and healthy living to try and reverse it. So there's a few tricks for type 2 diabetes. One of them is cinnamon. Cinnamon helps to diffuse the sugar, and apple cider vinegar helps. Now, yeah, it's not nice. It's really sour. So what you can do, two ways of getting it in a better way, is you can make salad dressing with it. So a bit of olive oil and cider vinegar as a salad dressing. And then what I did is I would buy a bottle of fizzy water, sparkling water, and I would pour some apple cider vinegar into it. So it's very diluted by the water, but because it's fizzy and sparkling, I can pretend that it's sour cider, sour apple juice. So I get it down me that way. But, you know, but I wouldn't want to drink it neat. It's too much, you know. Yeah. But a small amount in a glass of sparkling water can do that. And that's going to help disperse the sugars in the blood.
And also there's the old folk remedy where you do a teaspoon of apple cider and a teaspoon of honey, and it balances the alkaline acid. That's an old folk remedy. And actually, you know, in the States anyways, Bragg that makes apple cider vinegar makes these little drinks now. I just bought one, and they put it's apple cider vinegar and has ginger. I actually diluted it because it's strong, so it lasted a long time. But yeah, you get used to the taste, and you just do a little, you know, as much as you can.
I think that's
I like the taste. On my I have irritable bowel syndrome, and if I put the wrong thing in my system, man, I'm in pain.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if that would
Well,
trigger
maybe find out. It might be helpful. I don't know, but it might
Okay.
be opposite.
in
And
the
once I worked at a weight loss clinic as a consultant, and we had specific training, and all the consultants would gather in the break room in the morning. We had shot glasses and huge bottles of apple cider vinegar, and we all do shots. First, we drink like a small 6 ounces of water, just plain water, and then do the shot. And it did help with a lot of balancing of issues for a lot of the women, so, and men, but we didn't have very many male counselors, so that was interesting.
Kushler's
Just a
just
shot.
written that apple cider vinegar with hot water helps to pass kidney stones as well.
Oh,
So hot water and a bit of honey might be a good way of drinking the medicine.
It seems that when you
The JJ's holding a bottle
Sorry.
up.
Yeah, I just take a tablespoon of it neat each morning.
Oh,
It
do
does
you?
make me sort of well, but it's lovely. You get used to it. Yeah, that's how I take it. I'm not really recommending that, but it works for me.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I was just wondering about Avalon and Vézelay. Why Avalon here was named after Avalon and not maybe Vézelay instead? What's the significance of Avalon? Friends.
So Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1136 wrote a fictional history of the kings of Britain, and he just mentions Avalon in passing, but because he mentioned it in passing, everyone was intrigued to know more. Tell us more about this place, you know. So in 1136, all he said about it was that King Arthur's sword was forged in Avalon. And then at the end of Arthur's story, he says Arthur was taken to Avalon to be healed of his mortal wound. And that's it. And then people are like, well, what's Avalon? Tell us about Avalon. It's not in the Welsh archives, you know. And so about 15 years later, in 1150, he wrote another story about Merlin. It's called the Vita Merlini, the life of Merlin. And he goes into more detail about Avalon. It's like he's giving the audience what they were asking for, if you like. And it tells the story of Merlin being in the Caledonian forest. He's got like post-traumatic stress disorder, and they just say he's mad. He's living as a madman in the forest. And in the story, Taliesin, the chief of bards, goes to see Merlin, and they have a long conversation, and Merlin is brought back to his sanity. It's a really interesting read. It's worth getting a copy, because Taliesin's conversation with Merlin is full of esoteric cosmology. It's really, really fascinating. I would
what's the title of that again?
So the story's called The Life of Merlin, or in Latin, its Latin name is the Vitae Merlini by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So in that story, Taliesin, Merlin says what became of Arthur, like he's been mad and he can't remember things. And Taliesin then explains how they took Arthur to the Fortunate Isle, the Isle of Avalon, to the Lady Morgan and her sisters. So I've touched on this on the current journal because Lady Morgan is the head of 9 sisters on this island of Avalon and stuff. But it's quite clear in the story that it's somewhere otherworldly, because just before Taliesin explains that, he also talks about the apples in the island of Hesperides, you know, the Greek mythology of the apples of Hesperides. So they're talking about otherworldly, mysterious realms. And then Taliesin says, this is where we took Arthur, blah, 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 and stuff, you know. So Geoffrey of Monmouth was always clear that he was talking about an other world, and he gave it the name Avalon. And I would suggest that the inspiration for his name for it was this place in France, which is connected to Glastonbury through the Benedictine order. But the Welsh word would be Annuin. Now, the evidence suggests that Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote the story in Latin, he wasn't a Welsh speaker. So he wasn't going to use the word Annuin, you know. He seems to have been a Breton from northern France, Brittany, and a lot of Breton people went to England with the Norman invasion in 1066. So he's writing about Breton folk stories that correspond with Arthur and Wales, but he seems quite ignorant of Welsh language, hence saying Avalon rather than Annuin, you know. It's complicated.
And I'm holding,
you know, a rose by any other
holding up
name.
your book.
Sorry?
And there's
Yes.
so many
I'm holding up
vowels.
your book. Sorry.
JJ.
Yeah, this book, Gwyn,
Yeah.
and the God of Annuin,
Yes.
which you've written. I'd recommend it. I've really enjoyed it. It's got so much of what you talk about in relation to Avalon and Annuin, and I know
Everything he
Glastonbury
writes is
quite well,
great.
and it really
People
brings
get
it
very
alive.
emotional because they want Glastonbury to be Avalon. Equally, the other world is everywhere. It's in Cornwall, it's in Scotland, it's in France, it's in America, it's in China. The other world is everywhere, you know. So was Geoffrey of Monmouth talking about a market town in Somerset? You know, it's tricky. Yeah. But since 1191, so for 800 years, Glastonbury has been Avalon. You know, it's got 800 years of that culture and that self-belief. So it is still a very important place. But its Brythonic thing is Unis Vitrin, the Glass Isle, the Isle of Glass.
Yeah.
And this healing sanctuary in the Avalone in France has only been known about since the 1970s. They thought it was castle remains until they did the archaeology and then found a Bronze Age healing sanctuary. So that's really fascinating. I want to go back and, you know, somehow French romance remembered this healing sanctuary in the Avalone, you know, and I think that's what inspired Geoffrey of Monmouth.
It's right in the middle of France?
Burgundy.
Burgundy.
So it's west of the Alps, middle-ish.
Where's
Yuri?
Caledonia, where you were talking about?
The Caledonian Forest is the Scotland, north of the River Clyde.
Okay.
Andrew?
Yes. Yeah, something that came up for me during the talk right at the beginning was the apple being the forbidden fruit, and therefore, and because it's at the summer solstice time, and over here we've had the privilege of celebrating what someone calls Mary Mass, which is like the welcoming back of the darkness. And it's interesting that the apple's the forbidden fruit, which kind of brought death in the Genesis story. And yeah, you know, the idea as well as summer solstice being the celebration of the sun, it's also like the 3 days after the solstice being like the return of the darkness, basically.
Yes, you could say the Sun King is dying after the summer solstice, and the days are getting shorter again, sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's
And yeah,
there's an interesting polarity thing, you know, so like opposite Apple is the yew tree. So when the sun's at Apple, the full moon is going to be yew. And so at midwinter, when we're in the days of yew, the full moon's going to be an apple moon. And in Somerset, with the apple orchards, they have wassailing ceremonies, which are blessings of the apple orchards. And the traditional time to do that is the 6th of January, which seems a bit odd, but actually the 6th of January is the original Christmas day of the old Julian calendar before the Gregorian calendar.
Wasn't that 12th night?
Yeah.
Isn't it the 6th, 12th night?
Yes, that's right. So it was actually, you know, old Christmas was the wassailing time. So it's that polarity between winter solstice and summer solstice.
wow.
Interesting.
A wassailing we will go.
Wassailing, that's right. Yeah. It's a, yeah. Is it Saxon? It's Saxon for be of good health or something, I think.
Do you do anything to celebrate the return of the darkness, Yuri?
Am I going to celebrate the return of the darkness? I think the third ACMA with this sacred marriage is in some ways it's a conclusion of the Lunacy is kind of like this marriage moment. And if you think of the wedding night having a honeymoon night, 9 months later, a child is born, and that's Beltane. You know, so Taliesin is born at Beltane. So Taliesin was conceived or swallowed by Ceridwen at Lunacy. So this, you've got the vine and the wine mixing crater, the constellation, and the sacred marriage with the broom goddess Blodaiweth. It's kind of another summer goddess at Lunacy. That sacred marriage then is the descent into the mystery traditions again, you know. So yes, the energy is going down. There's this marriage feast, and then the initiates go down into the mystery rites again through the wild heath and the water's edge, and carry on again, you know. So yeah, this is the energy rising to the summer solstice.
When is the
descending?
When is the marriage union? When is the marriage union thing?
So I would say it's Lunacy.
Yeah.
Right, Lama.
Yeah, Lammas, Lunacy. Yeah.
But all those Celtic gods and goddesses, oh, they're just so enchanting.
Yeah. And most of the old stories, even King Arthur and Guinevere, and other stories in the Mabinogion, it's the sun hero and a sovereignty goddess. That's the basic storyline, really. It's just told in different ways with different names, sort of thing. Yeah.
And what about the Welsh tradition? I mean, you know, because you know, with Merlin and saying that he, you know, yeah, I'd like, where does that come from?
So you have to, like we're saying, you have to compartmentalize your brain. So there's the medieval stories, and Merlin is part of the medieval stories, and the old Welsh material doesn't have him, or actually it has a wizard deity with a different name, but they have the same sort of story. So it's kind of what inspired Geoffrey of Monmouth to tell this story of Merlin is this Welsh god of magic and tree magic and stuff. So there's that going on. But then after Geoffrey of Monmouth told his Merlin stories, the Welsh bards incorporated it, you know. So you have old Welsh stories, medieval stories, and then later Welsh bardic tradition incorporating Merthin, you know, and so it grows. But if you take Merlin literally as a historical figure, then he's a king of South Wales from the 6th century.
Oh.
You know, that's his story, you know, to be there as part of King Arthur's era, you know. Arthur, Taliesin, Merlin, they're all of the 6th century.
Right.
So Yuri, would they have all been in the Celtic church then? They would have been part of a Celtic Christianity.
It's possible, isn't it? You know, I think the stories suggest that Merlin is something pre-Christian. You know, his father's described as a succubi or an incubi. I get muddled up which one's male, which one's female. But like he was half human, half devil. You know, and it's the devil side of him that gave him the magic and sort of thing. But bear in mind, this is medieval Christianity telling this story as well. You know, so anything that isn't Christian is dodgy. You know, so even the great Queen Morrigan or the Lady Morgan eventually becomes Morgan le Fay, the arch nemesis and destruction of Camelot. You know, but that wasn't the original Morgan. That's Christianity twisting it and changing it. So originally Guinevere is a Venus goddess. Even in modern Welsh today, the planet Venus is called Gwenna. Gwenna is the name of Venus, you know, and so she was this triple goddess. But under the stories, she has adultery with Sir Lancelot, becomes a nun, and lives in shame in a monastery. That's not the Venus goddess, you know, that's medieval stories. Same. So,
influence.
Yeah, which the Arthurian stuff is. So you've got, you know, King Arthur's knights are looking for the cup of the Last Supper or the sword that decapitated John the Baptist. This is Christianization. It's not the Iron Age Celtic stuff.
That's why it never made sense to me that King Arthur, I'm sorry. That's why it never made sense to me that King Arthur was the, you know, the Arthur and the land are one, and then suddenly his knights are looking for the Holy Grail. I never could put that together. I never understood that, but now I know why. Because the Christians wanted it that way.
Yeah, but it came also from when Chrétien de Troyes wrote his version of the King Arthur stories, and as Yuri said, and he wrote in about chivalry and blushing maids and everything, and knights clanking around in armor, which is absolute nonsense. We're talking more about Arthur, who was a warrior king, a Celtic warrior king. It was only when the French version came in and was, you know, it became very popular, that you suddenly got Lancelot and Guinevere and the love story, the adultery and everything. Up until then, it was far more, shall we say, earthier. I've just sort of dug a book out of my bookcase behind me, and there's a very good book called King Arthur, and what's it called? King Arthur, Morgan and her sisters in Arthurian tradition.
Nice.
And it's by a lady called Caroline Larrington, and it's probably one of the best books I've ever read about Arthur's relationships with Morgan and her sisters. It's well, if you can get a copy of it, it's well worth trying to dig it out, actually.
Repeat the title, please.
It's called
And the last name?
King Arthur's Enchantress. You'll have to excuse me. I had a tooth taken out today, so my face is a bit out. It's called King Arthur's Enchantresses, and it's by Caroline Larrington.
You're British author?
Yeah, yeah, but you probably find it on Amazon or somewhere. You'll probably get a copy of it.
Thank you.
So I would also just add that it's very complicated, but the Welsh material about Arthur is very, very different to the European romances.
Yeah, very
Like
much. So.
the Welsh Arthur has this triple goddess Queen Guinevere, three queens called Guinevere, but he's also involved with gods and goddesses. So, for instance, the Winter King and Summer King, Gwyn ap Neath and Gwythyr ap Gridle, it's Arthur that fixes them to having a battle every Beltane. Yeah. You know, and in the story of how Cilwch won Olwen, there's all of these impossible tasks, like Hercules having to do all these impossible tasks. Yeah. And these impossible tasks are to do with star law and constellations. So the Welsh material is obscure, it's complicated, it's strange names, and it's star lore, and it's gods and goddesses. That's very different to Guinevere and her adultery with Lancelot and Percival looking for the Holy Grail. You know, the Welsh Arthur and the French romances are worlds apart, really. Yet in the modern world, they're all jumbled together, you know, because most people know is the film Excalibur, or it's the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Excalibur is based on the writings of Thomas Malory. These are much later versions than even the old French stuff, which is a world away from the old Welsh stuff, you know. So it's very difficult. So someone said today, what do you recommend for someone getting into the Arthur stuff? That's what I said. I said, what are you interested in? You know, if you're interested in that Guinevere and Lancelot, that's French stuff. But if you want Arthur interacting with gods and goddesses, that's Welsh, and it's obscure, you know.
How do they describe Guinevere in the old Welsh myths?
Yes, so here's an interesting thing then. I forgot this. There's 3 Guineveres, and in the Welsh triads, you can look them up. I forget which triad it is, but it's King Arthur's 3 queens. And it gives you, they're all called Guinevere, but each of them has a different father. So the 3 fathers are really interesting. And one of them is Gwythyr ap Gridle. So that's the Summer King who fights Gwyn ap Neath every Beltane. So at least one of the 3 Guineveres is the daughter of the Summer King, you know, and then you have to get your head around the other 2, you know. It's too complicated to just, bleh, you know, you've got to really sit with it and meditate on it and so on.
Got to cogitate there. Yeah. And they're all like aspects of Maiden Mother Crone or the Triple Goddess, or, you know, that whole collective there. So very interesting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Which was the god you equated with Merlin in Welsh? Is it Gwydion?
Yeah. Yes, it's Gwydion. Yeah, and they both do similar things. If you look at the story of Gwydion and his sister Arianrod, she's tricked. She's actually tricked by magic into giving birth to the Sun King against her will. So that's the same as Merlin helping Uther trick Igraine into conceiving Arthur. So they're using magical trickery to get a woman pregnant, you know. And then they both take it, you know, Gwydion raises Llai to be the Summer King, and it all goes drastically wrong. And Merlin raises Arthur, and Arthur's story goes wrong. You know, it comes to a terrible ending, really. Guinevere in Merlin's story is abducted either by Mordred or has an affair with Lancelot, depending on which story you're looking at. And in Gwydion's story, Cly's wife, Queen Blodeuwedd, actually brings about his death. You know, so there are similarities between Merlin and Gwydion. Gwydion means born of the trees or holy of the trees, depending on how you interpret his name. And he's all about tree magic. And Merlin lives as a wild man in a Caledonian forest. So there's a lot of similarities between the 6th century Merlin and the Welsh god of tree magic.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. See, Geoffrey of Monmouth didn't want Celtic gods and goddesses. He turns them all into human beings. You know, that's one way of so Morrigan becomes Morgan Le Fay, becomes a woman. You know, the Venus goddess Gwenna becomes a mortal queen. You know, the old gods are turned into human beings in the medieval writings.
And disempowered in that too.
Yeah, disempowered.
You think? Yeah.
So anyway, we better do our meditation. So I'll stop recording, and if you put your microphones off.